Welcome to the Pro Ticker Deep Dive.
No.
Today we're looking at a sudden, massive geopolitical shockwave that is currently rewiring global energy markets and really the underlying architecture of the world economy.
Yeah, rewiring is definitely the right word for it.
Right, because as of late February and early March 2026, a major, unprecedented military conflict has erupted involving the United States, Israel, and Iran. And while the mainstream headlines are obsessively focused on the kinetic military strikes, the troop movements, and, the diplomatic rhetoric in Washington and capitals around the world.
The stuff that gets the clicks, basically.
Exactly. The real story for you, the listener, the one that will inevitably dictate your grocery bill, the cost of your daily commute, your discretionary income, and the interest rate on your mortgage, is happening far away from the smoking craters. It is unfolding in a narrow strip of water in the Middle East and on the incredibly chaotic floors of global commodities exchanges.
And the challenge right now is filtering out that immense volume of immediate noise, right? The objective today is to map out the direct transmission mechanisms between a localized, albeit massive, overseas conflict, the sudden paralysis of the world's most critical supply chain choke point, and your daily economic reality.
Because it's all connected.
It is entirely connected. When you introduce a disruption of this staggering magnitude into a region that functions as the undisputed cornerstone of the global energy grid, it does not remain a localized geopolitical dispute. It instantly metastasizes into a mathematical certainty that impacts global inflation, central bank policy, and the baseline cost of heavy manufacturing, transportation, and consumer goods. We need to examine the structural vulnerabilities of this system and really how they are buckling under the current pressure.
Okay, I want to start with the timeline of events just to establish the sheer scale of the disruption we are looking at. The primary catalyst occurred on February 28, 2026. The U.S. and Israel initiated highly coordinated joint military campaigns. The U.S. operational theater was designated Operation Epic Fury, and the Israeli component was named Operation Lion's Roar. And when you look at the raw data of these strikes, the scope is genuinely difficult to visualize.
It's massive.
Yeah, approximately 500 strategic targets were hit across Iranian territory in a remarkably compressed time frame. Coordinating a strike of that magnitude across varied airspace is an astonishing logistical feat.
It is. And the sheer volume of munitions dropped is notable, but the strategic intent behind the target selection is what triggered the current global fallout. This was not a punitive, localized strike on peripheral military assets. It was a methodical, systemic dismantling of the core of Iran's ruling regime.
A decapitation strike, essentially.
Precisely. The operation resulted in the death of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And the sudden removal of an absolute theocratic leader instantly creates a massive, unpredictable power vacuum. Beyond the Supreme Leader, the strikes eliminated the defense minister, the chief of staff of the armed forces, and approximately 40 other high-ranking officials. They effectively severed the head and the central nervous system of the state apparatus in a matter of hours.
And the physical infrastructure hits were just as severe. I mean, they targeted the Isfahan uranium conversion facility, the Bushehr nuclear power plant site, and the deep-water port of Chabahar on the Gulf of Oman. Taking out a major deep-water port alone completely alters maritime logistics in the region, independent of the nuclear facilities.
Absolutely.
But in geopolitics, a strike of this magnitude guarantees a massive counteroffensive. Iran obviously did not just absorb the blow and retreat.
No, the retaliation was instantaneous, and it completely disregarded conventional boundaries. Iran responded with intense, overlapping waves of ballistic missiles and drone swarms. However, they did not restrict their targeting to Israeli territory or isolated U.S. naval groups in the Mediterranean or the Red Sea.
Right, they went much wider.
They did. The conflict expanded violently and immediately across the entire region. Iran targeted U.S. military installations and, crucially, allied energy infrastructure across 8 different neighboring sovereign nations.
8 nations.
8. The retaliation blanketed airspace over Bahrain, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates.
And that specific detail changes the entire nature of the crisis. They didn't just go after military targets. They actively went after the money. They went after the oil and gas infrastructure that keeps the lights on in Europe and the factories running in Asia.
You are identifying the most critical pivot point of this entire conflict right there. This was a highly calculated strike on the economic engines of the global economy. We saw direct, sustained hits on Saudi Aramco's Ras Tanura refinery,
And we should explain what Ras Tanura is because it's not just some standard facility.
Right. To understand the gravity of that, Ras Tanura is not just some localized pumping station. It is a crown jewel of the global downstream oil sector, boasting a refining capacity of 550,000 barrels per day.
Wow.
When you hit a refinery of that scale, you aren't just stopping the flow of crude. You are destroying the highly specialized equipment, the catalytic crackers, the distillation towers required to turn crude oil into usable diesel, aviation fuel, and gasoline.
It takes years to rebuild those.
Exactly. Furthermore, the strikes interrupted Qatar's liquefied natural gas, or LNG, production. Qatar is one of the top 2 LNG exporters on the planet, alongside the United States. By targeting these specific, high-value economic nodes, the retaliation was explicitly designed to inflict maximum economic pain globally. It is a brutal reminder to the international community that if their domestic infrastructure is burning, the global economy will foot the bill.
Which brings us directly to the geographic center of gravity for this entire crisis, the Strait of Hormuz. We often hear it described as the global economy's jugular vein. It is an incredibly narrow sliver of water connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean. Almost all the energy produced in the Persian Gulf has to squeeze through this tiny bottleneck.
The baseline statistics surrounding the Strait of Hormuz dictate the architecture of global trade. Under normal pre-conflict conditions, this specific waterway handles 15.8 million barrels of crude oil every single day.
15.8 million.
Every day. That volume represents roughly 20 to 25% of total global daily oil consumption. 1/5 to 1/4 of the energy the world requires to function must pass through a maritime corridor that, at its narrowest point, is only 21 miles wide.
And it's not even 21 miles of usable water.
No, not at all. The navigable shipping channels within that 21 miles are actually much narrower, only about 2 miles wide in each direction. Additionally, the strait handles roughly 20% of the world's total LNG supply, overwhelmingly sourced from Qatar and the UAE. It is the single most critical, irreplaceable energy choke point on Earth.
But the reality on the water right now is that this jugular vein is effectively severed. Transit through the strait has collapsed. The maritime traffic data shows a drop of roughly 87%.
That's a ghost town.
To put that into perspective, a waterway that normally sees around 36 massive oil and gas tankers successfully navigating it every single day saw a grand total of exactly 3 vessels successfully transit on March 4th. The satellite imagery shows over 150 massive vessels just sitting at anchor, idling in the water, terrified to move.
The mechanism of this blockade is what makes it so difficult to resolve. A waterway is not shut down by a physical concrete barricade. It is shut down by a financial wall.
Insurance.
Exactly. The barrier to entry right now is maritime insurance. Commercial vessels are legally and financially required to carry various types of insurance, specifically war risk premiums, when entering zones designated as high risk by maritime insurance syndicates, such as the Joint War Committee in London. Because of the missile strikes, the active drone swarms, and the explicit threats to commercial shipping, those war risk insurance premiums have exploded by an estimated 3,000%.
Wait, break that math down for me. What does a 3,000% increase actually look like for a shipping company trying to move a cargo of crude?
Okay, prior to the conflict, the baseline war risk premium was roughly 0.1% of a vessel's total value. Overnight, that premium jumped to an astonishing 15 to 20%.
That is insane.
If you have a massive tanker valued at $100 million, carrying a cargo of crude oil valued at another $100 million, the insurance syndicate is demanding tens of millions of dollars up front just to underwrite the voyage through the strait. It makes transiting commercially prohibitive. The financial risk simply obliterates any potential profit margin.
So they just stop sailing.
They have to. As a direct result, major global shipping lines heavyweights like Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd have completely suspended their bookings for the Persian Gulf. You cannot legally or financially operate a vessel when the insurance premiums rival the value of the asset, setting aside the unacceptable physical danger to the crew.
So the front door is completely deadbolted by the insurance syndicates. These ships have to find another way around. They have to reroute. And the only viable alternative for ships originating elsewhere is going all the way south, down the western coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and up into the Indian Ocean.
The logistical cascade from that reroute is devastating to the global supply chain. Diverting a massive tanker around the Cape of Good Hope adds anywhere from 10 to 14 days to a standard voyage.
Each way.
Each way. When you add 2 solid weeks to a trip, you are effectively removing those ships from the global fleet for that duration. They are tied up at sea, burning massive amounts of bunker fuel, rather than returning to port to load the next batch of oil. This creates an immediate severe shortage in the sheer number of available ships globally.
Supply and demand.
Right. Because hull capacity is suddenly incredibly scarce, the cost to charter a vessel skyrockets. We have seen freight rates for very large crude carriers, the massive ships known as VLCCs, which can carry roughly 2 million barrels of oil, explode from a normal daily rate of about $28,700 to a staggering $420,000 a day.
$420,000 a day just to rent the boat. That cost doesn't just disappear, it gets baked directly into the price of the oil it's carrying. So we have refineries on fire, the main shipping lane financially blockaded, and the cost of transport multiplying by 15. The immediate financial fallout on the commodity exchanges must have been violent.
The market reaction was immediate and deeply aggressive. Brent crude, which serves as the international benchmark for physical oil pricing, surged roughly 13 to 17% in the initial trading sessions. It smashed decisively through the $80 a barrel mark, up from the low $70 where it had been trading comfortably just days prior. U.S. domestic crude followed the exact same trajectory. The commodity markets went into an immediate panic pricing mode.
I want to dig into that $80 plus price tag. A large portion of that isn't just the cost of pumping the oil, it's a geopolitical risk premium. How exactly do traders calculate a risk premium when there are 150 ships stranded and missiles flying?
The geopolitical risk premium is essentially a fear tax layered onto the physical commodity value. Right now, commodities markets are pricing in an extra $14 to $18 per barrel, purely out of the fear of a prolonged disruption.
Just based on fear?
Yes. Traders are looking at the burning infrastructure in the paralyzed strait, and they are demanding a premium to take on the risk that this blockade lasts for weeks or months. It is the market's way of hedging against the unknown. If the blockade were to lift tomorrow, that $14 to $18 premium would evaporate. But as long as the strait remains uninsurable, that premium acts as a hard floor under the price of oil.
And it is absolutely crucial to note that this is not isolated to crude oil. The shockwaves hit other critical energy and asset markets just as hard. European natural gas futures spiked over 70% in just 2 days. Why? Because all that Qatari LNG we discussed earlier is trapped behind the Strait of Hormuz.
And Europe needs that gas.
Desperately. Europe's winter energy grid relies heavily on a steady stream of LNG cargoes to replace the piped gas they used to get from Russia. Suddenly, a massive percentage of their supply is physically walled off. Meanwhile, global investors, watching the energy markets catch fire, absolutely fled from risk. They poured capital into traditional safe havens, pushing the price of gold up to an unprecedented $5,400 an ounce.
While the financial markets panic over futures contracts, there is a secondary physical engineering crisis developing on the ground that is equally dangerous, and that's the storage bottleneck.
Explain that, because I don't think most people realize how the physical pumping works.
Right, because the maritime tankers aren't moving through the strait, the nations pumping the oil suddenly have nowhere to put it. An oil well is not like a faucet. You cannot simply flip a switch and instantly stop an entire country's production without risking long-term damage to the reservoir's pressure dynamics. So they keep pumping, but the exit door is locked. This means their massive onshore storage tanks are filling up at an alarming rate.
They're running out of buckets.
Exactly. Iraq, for instance, has already had to physically cut their crude production by 1.5 million barrels a day, not because their wells were targeted by missiles, but purely because their storage tanks are full to the brim. If the ships do not arrive to load the crude, the entire localized system backs up, forcing countries to shut in their production entirely.
The irony of the timing here is almost unbelievable. Right as this physical backup was happening, right as the missiles were in the air and the insurance markets were freezing, the OPEC Plus cartel held a previously scheduled meeting on March 1st, and their grand announcement. They stated they would boost global oil production by 206,000 barrels per day starting in April.
The announcement highlights a profound disconnect between administrative policy and physical reality.
It's mathematically absurd. They are offering to add 206,000 barrels a day to a market that is currently missing almost 16 million barrels because the strait is paralyzed.
The OPEC Plus announcement exposes a massive structural trap in the global energy system, which we define as geographic concentration risk. It is a factual statement that the world possesses spare oil capacity. OPEC Plus is sitting on roughly 3.5 million barrels per day of oil that they could, theoretically, bring online to suppress surging global prices. But you have to look at where that spare capacity physically resides.
Behind the blockade.
Precisely. Over 50% of that spare capacity is located inside Saudi Arabia. Nearly 30% of it is located in the UAE. The fundamental flaw in the system is that both Saudi Arabia and the UAE rely overwhelmingly on the exact same Strait of Hormuz to export that oil to the global market. You cannot flood the market with spare capacity if the exit door is bolted shut. The world's emergency energy buffer is physically trapped behind the exact same choke point that is causing the crisis.
But surely these producing nations anticipated a scenario where the strait might be threatened. Why can't they just pipe the oil overland to a different body of water, bypass the Persian Gulf entirely?
They've constructed bypass pipelines precisely for this nightmare contingency, but the engineering math is brutal. Saudi Arabia operates the East-West pipeline, often referred to as Petroline. It carries crude all the way across the Arabian Peninsula to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, completely bypassing the Strait of Hormuz. The UAE operates the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, which runs to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, safely outside the strait.
So the pipes are there.
The infrastructure exists. However, the throughput capacity of these pipelines is severely constrained. Combined, these bypass routes can only handle a fraction of the total daily volume that normally flows through the strait. It's like trying to drain a massive reservoir through a garden hose. They can alleviate a small degree of the localized pressure, but they are physically incapable of compensating for a total, prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
So we have a paralyzed choke point, skyrocketing transport costs, trapped spare capacity, and inadequate bypass infrastructure. It is time to translate this macro-level dysfunction into the micro-level reality for you, the listener, because this geopolitical chess game is about to hit your bank account directly through the mechanism of inflation.
The economic transmission of an energy shock is highly predictable and universally painful. We look at a well-established macroeconomic rule of thumb. A sustained $10 increase in the price of a barrel of oil generally pushes overall annual consumer inflation up by roughly 0.2 percentage points. The modern economy is entirely reliant on cheap energy. Every item you purchase, the produce at the grocery store, the clothes you wear, the electronics shipped to your door, requires hydrocarbons to manufacture, package, and transport.
The shipping alone.
Right. When the baseline cost of that energy spikes, every single node in the global supply chain passes that increased cost down the line to preserve their own margins. The cascade inevitably ends with the end consumer paying the bill. In the United States, we're looking at an immediate environment where gasoline prices could easily breach $3.50 a gallon and push significantly higher depending on the duration of the maritime blockade.
And this sudden, unavoidable injection of inflation is causing absolute panic inside the world's central banks. Just prior to this conflict, the financial markets were comfortably pricing in a series of interest rate cuts. The assumption was that the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and the European Central Bank had successfully tamed the post-pandemic inflation and were preparing to lower borrowing costs.
They thought they were out of the woods.
Exactly. And this oil shock incinerates those economic models. The probability of the U.S. Fed cutting interest rates 3 times by the end of 2026 collapsed from 50% to just 20% in a matter of days.
The dilemma paralyzing these central bankers is critical to understand, and it forces us to look at the underlying macroeconomic formulas they rely on, specifically the Taylor Rule. The Taylor Rule is an economic model that dictates how central banks should alter interest rates in response to changes in economic conditions. It attempts to balance 2 inherently conflicting mandates, the need to suppress inflation and the need to support economic output.
Right.
Right now, central banks are trapped in a no-win scenario. If they raise interest rates to aggressively fight off this new wave of oil-driven inflation, they risk freezing credit markets, making borrowing prohibitively expensive for businesses trying to expand and everyday people trying to buy homes, which crushes economic growth.
But if they leave rates alone or cut them as they originally planned, they pour gasoline on the inflationary fire.
Precisely the trap. If they fail to act, inflation spirals, eroding the purchasing power of the currency. This policy paralysis raises the terrifying economic specter of stagflation. Stagflation is arguably the most difficult macroeconomic condition to cure. It is a period characterized by stagnant, flatlining economic growth combined simultaneously with high, punishing inflation. The central bank's primary weapon, adjusting the cost of money, becomes entirely ineffective because fixing one side of the equation destroys the other. It is the exact economic nightmare the global economy endured during the oil embargoes of the 1970s.
And there is a specific threshold number flashing in bright red across trading desks that signals the onset of that nightmare. It's $100 a barrel. Analysts are warning that if this blockade of the strait persists for over a month, the price of oil won't just linger in the 80 years. It could easily smash through $100 a barrel, with some models projecting spikes up to 103 a barrel.
If the global market crosses that $100 to $113 threshold and sustains it, it triggers a destructive macroeconomic phenomenon known as demand destruction. Demand destruction is not a gentle pullback in spending. It occurs when the price of a foundational commodity gets so prohibitively expensive that consumers and businesses simply stop consuming it because they literally lack the capital to do so.
They just can't afford it.
It is forced rationing by price. You see airlines grounding routes because the jet fuel ruins the profitability of the flight. You see heavy manufacturing throttling down production lines because the electricity and fuel inputs wipe out their margins. Everyday people cancel vacations and defer spending on everything but absolute essentials. Demand destruction is the market's violent, forced method of rebalancing supply and demand when supply cannot be increased. It almost universally forces the global economy into a severe, prolonged recession.
I want to shift our focus from the economic models back to the grand geopolitical chessboard. Because the strategies being deployed right now to secure this energy flow are reshaping global alliances in real time. The U.S. strategy, which operates under the doctrine of peace through strength, isn't merely about defending allied nations like Israel or neutralizing the Iranian military apparatus. It is fundamentally about securing the Persian Gulf to prevent the world's primary energy supply from falling under the monopolistic influence of global adversaries.
The overarching strategic reality is that the United States views the unhindered flow of maritime commerce through the Strait of Hormuz as a vital national security interest. They act as the ultimate guarantor of security in the region because the stability of the entire global economic order depends on it. However, while the U.S. is deploying carrier strike groups and expending massive resources to secure the shipping lanes, you have to look at who is actually the most structurally vulnerable to this disruption.
Right. It's not the U.S.
No, it is Asia. China is massively exposed to this specific choke point. China imports over 10 million barrels of crude oil every single day to fuel its industrial base, and a massive percentage of that must physically transit through Hormuz. India is in an even more precarious, dependent position. They import roughly 85% of their total crude oil requirements.
So when the strait is closed, these massive Asian economies, which represent the primary growth engines of the global market, are instantly starved of energy. It forces them into a desperate, panicked bidding war for alternative energy supplies from anywhere else on the planet, which just drives the global price up even further for everyone else.
This scramble for alternative supplies is actively accelerating a massive reshuffle in the global crude trade, specifically concerning Russian oil. You have to layer the current crisis over the existing framework of global sanctions. Over the past few years, due to Western sanctions, Russian oil has been heavily discounted and was flowing in massive volumes to India. However, due to the tightening enforcement of those sanctions by Western maritime services and the chaotic environment of the current crisis, India has actually been aggressively scaling back its purchases of Russian crude.
So you have millions of barrels of discounted, heavily sanctioned Russian oil suddenly looking for a new buyer right at the exact moment the Strait of Hormuz shuts down. Who is stepping in to buy it?
China. China is aggressively and strategically absorbing those orphaned, discounted Russian barrels. The blockade in the Middle East is actively forcing China and Russia into a much tighter, more deeply integrated energy relationship. It is a marriage of sheer necessity and geopolitical opportunism. The crisis is accelerating the bifurcation of the global energy market, creating a distinct, resilient energy corridor between Moscow and Beijing that operates outside the traditional Western financial and maritime insurance structures.
I want to pivot back to the internal situation in Iran because the power vacuum created by the U.S. and Israeli strikes is the ultimate wild card dictating the timeline of this crisis. With the sudden death of Supreme Leader Khamenei, the absolute top of the Iranian state is entirely empty. How that vacuum is filled will dictate whether this maritime blockade ends next week or next year.
Geopolitical analysts are currently mapping out 4 potential internal futures for Iran's regime transition. The probability of each specific scenario materializing directly impacts the duration and severity of the Hormuz blockade. Scenario 1 is the status quo transition, which the intelligence community currently views as having a high probability. In this scenario, the 88-member Assembly of Experts manages to act quickly and cohesively to elect a new supreme leader. This outcome consolidates power swiftly and maintains the current theocratic system with minimal structural changes to the state's ideology or military posture.
But how does an 88-member clerical assembly function efficiently under the extreme duress of a nationwide bombing campaign and decapitated military leadership? If they stall, we move into the second scenario.
That structural friction leads directly to Scenario 2, a long-term transition, viewed as having a medium-high probability. If the Assembly fails to immediately agree on a single, unifying successor, a Provisional Guidance Committee takes over the political and diplomatic face of the country. However, the real functional power, the control over the borders, the internal security apparatus, and the military response shifts decisively behind the scenes to the generals of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC.
And the IRGC is a completely different entity than the traditional clerical leadership. If they are calling the shots, the strategy regarding the strait could become much more aggressive. But what if they decide they no longer need the clerical facade at all?
That is Scenario 3, a formal military coup, though analysts currently assign this a low probability. In this outcome, the IRGC formally and publicly seizes total administrative and political control of the state, discarding the clerical leadership structure entirely. The primary reason this is deemed low probability is a matter of practical economics and internal stability. The IRGC already controls an estimated 30 to 50% of the entire Iranian macroeconomy.
Right, they own everything anyway.
Exactly. They heavily influence the telecommunications sector, the massive construction conglomerates, and the energy export infrastructure. They hold immense, lucrative power behind the scenes already. Launching a formal public coup might expose them to unnecessary internal backlash and civil unrest when they already reap the primary financial benefits of controlling the state apparatus.
And the final scenario is the one that introduces the most extreme volatility to the energy markets.
Scenario 4 is total regime collapse, given a medium-low probability. In this chaotic outcome, the system fractures completely under the combined, crushing weight of the military strikes, decades of economic sanctions, and sudden domestic uprisings. This would lead to an internal revolution and a deeply messy, unpredictable transition to a completely new, undefined form of government. The crucial takeaway for the global markets is this. The internal Iranian power struggle dictates the timeline of the global economic paralysis. If a new supreme leader rapidly consolidates power, a diplomatic off-ramp might be negotiated quickly. If the state fractures into total civil war, the Strait of Hormuz could remain an uninsurable war zone for years.
Looking at the sheer scale of this disruption, the paralyzed shipping lanes, the destroyed refineries, the massive geopolitical realignment, a reasonable listener might be asking a very simple question. Why aren't things significantly worse right now? Why aren't we seeing lines forming around the block at gas stations like the world experienced during the 1970s oil shocks? There is a structural buffer in place today that simply did not exist 50 years ago.
The fundamental architecture of the global energy market is vastly different than it was during the 1970s embargoes. The primary structural difference, and the buffer preventing total global economic meltdown at this very second, is United States energy independence. Thanks to the shale revolution and advanced hydraulic fracturing technology, the United States has transformed from a deeply vulnerable importer into a massive, dominant producer of crude oil. Current U.S. shale production is hovering around an astounding 13 million barrels a day. The economic mechanics of shale are what provide the resilience. The break-even price for a U.S. shale producer, the price per barrel they require to cover their operating costs and turn a profit, is generally situated around $40 to $50 a barrel.
Right. So when the global price of Brent crude rockets past $80 or approaches $100 a barrel because of a war in the Middle East, those U.S. producers are suddenly staring at massive windfall profit margins. It creates an overwhelming financial incentive for domestic operators to fire up the drilling rigs and pump as much oil as physically possible.
The market economics provide their own organic shock absorber. Unlike massive, multi-billion-dollar offshore conventional drilling projects that take years to bring online, shale operators can bring drilled but uncompleted wells online in a matter of months. They can organically inject new supply into a starving global market much faster than historically possible. But beyond the private production response, the global system also relies on massive strategic buffers built specifically for this exact nightmare scenario.
The SPR.
Yes. The U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the SPR, currently holds roughly 370 million barrels of crude oil stored deep in underground salt caverns in Texas and Louisiana. Furthermore, the allied member states of the International Energy Agency, the IEA, hold an additional 1.2 billion barrels in their own globally distributed emergency reserves.
These stockpiles act as a massive, intentional shock absorber. They are the global economy's emergency savings account.
Exactly. They can be coordinated and released into the physical market to artificially suppress surging prices and, most importantly, prevent localized physical shortages of fuel. Releasing reserves cannot permanently fix a closed Strait of Hormuz. You eventually run out of stored oil. But it buys the global system vital time. It buys time for diplomats to negotiate a ceasefire, or time for military forces to clear the shipping lanes and reestablish maritime security. It prevents the immediate panic from turning into a structural collapse.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today, mapping out the architecture of a global crisis. To summarize the sheer scale of this deep dive, we are witnessing a targeted, highly coordinated military strike that has decapitated a regime and completely paralyzed the world's most vital maritime waterway. This 21-mile choke point has brought global shipping to its knees through an impenetrable wall of insurance premiums. It is threatening to reignite a brutal wave of global inflation, just as central banks believed they had stabilized the post-pandemic economy. It is actively shifting the balance of power and trade in Asia, pushing Russia and China into a tighter energy alliance, and ultimately, it is a macroeconomic shockwave that is going to force a harsh reckoning at the gas pump and the grocery checkout line for you, the listener, in the weeks and months to come.
As we monitor the immediate financial and geopolitical fallout across the trading floors, I want to leave you with a final, profound structural concept to consider. Right now, the most powerful nations on Earth are scrambling, deploying advanced carrier strike groups, and expending billions of dollars in military assets, all to protect the flow of fossil fuels through a deeply vulnerable, easily blockaded geographic choke point. But we must ask a broader question. Could this ultimate demonstration of supply chain fragility be the final, undeniable catalyst for the world to aggressively, permanently abandon oil? If the national security and fundamental economic stability of the entire globe are constantly held hostage by the volatile politics of a 21-mile-wide strait, then the massive capital transition to domestic, renewable energy solar grids, wind generation, and green hydrogen infrastructure is no longer merely a long-term environmental goal. It ceases to be just a climate change initiative. It becomes the ultimate urgent geopolitical imperative. The true, lasting historical legacy of this war might not be the peak price of a barrel of oil in 2026, but rather the rapid, forced acceleration of oil's total obsolescence.
A fascinating systemic perspective to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the invisible financial forces and volatile geographic choke points shaping your world. Stay curious, stay informed, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.